Well, welcome to chapter 3 of the book of Daniel. So, just to quickly recap, in our last session, we looked at events that took place during Daniel's first year of service following 3 years of training. And when his first year with Nebuchadnezzar, God had revealed to Daniel a mystery about a dream that the king had had and its interpretation. And essentially, that dream was an outline of what Yeshua refers to as the times of the Gentiles. And this would be from a human perspective, in that the image was considered impressive. Now, the dream consisted of this large image, as mentioned, with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. These would represent various Gentile kingdoms or empires, which would have control of Jerusalem in part or whole over this time period. However, of course, we also saw that this would all be brought to a sudden and definitive end when the stone not cut by human hands, which speaks to its divine origins and power, would wipe out this image from its feet. And so this, of course, represented the future return of Messiah at his second coming, when he removes these empires and any control they have over Jerusalem, and following which he'll rule with a rod of iron from the throne of David, not only of Jerusalem and Israel, but the world. And of course, his kingdom will last forever. So that was what we looked at last week. So this week we're moving into chapter 3. But before we do that, just a reminder that chapter 3 is part of the Aramaic chiasm that starts in chapter 2, where he starts writing in Aramaic from part of chapter 2 through to the end of chapter 7. And so this one here, we're looking at chapter 3. We're going to look at God's protection of believing Israel in terms of groups of believers. And that's going to later on pair up with chapter 6, which is God's protection of believing Israel and an individual believer, God's protection of Daniel specifically in chapter 6. All right, well, what we're going to see here are there are situations for Jewish believers where they will need to obey God rather than man. And because they obey God rather than man, they're going to actually enter into acts of what would be termed civil disobedience. Now, the application for us today is, although the Bible clearly teaches us to have respect for human authority, it does also allow for rare exceptions. We're going to look at those, where we can or we should be required as believers to follow a higher law, the law of God. So the general rule is we follow the rule of law, but there are occasions when we follow the law of God because the rule of law is actually breaking the law of God. So let's start with the invitation, which we see in Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, you notice here that Daniel does not give us a date in this particular chapter as to when this event occurred. So we don't know for sure. Now, of course, we have the wider dates of King Nebuchadnezzar's rule between 605 BC to 562 BC. But I think given the context of chapter 2, where you'll remember we had an image with only a head of gold, I think it would be safe to assume that these events take place after he'd had that dream and had received its interpretation, which was in 602 BC. So the next question is, well, what would motivate Nebuchadnezzar to build this kind of image, especially when we consider chapter 2 seems to be a response to the image of chapter 2, where it's replacing an image with only a head of gold with one which is entirely of gold. I think there's an obvious candidate, and historically, one clear motive would be the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Now, Jeremiah tells us when this occurred. It was in the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month. That was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And so it says that his bodyguard who served the king of Babylon entered Jerusalem at that time. Okay. So, of course, Jeremiah is using Jewish reckoning for counting years of the king. So this would be, in the Babylonian reckoning, his 18th year, because they have a year 0. Keep in mind, of course, as a pagan, Nebuchadnezzar believes that if you defeat the people, you in effect defeat their God. So when he returns for a third time to remove the last rightful heir of the throne of David in Jerusalem and also destroy their city of Jerusalem and temple, for him that would equal defeating the God of Israel. So I think there is a case for seeing the building of this image to be an act of willful defiance against that dream and its interpretation. So he's kind of saying, well, it's not just a head of gold, the whole thing's going to be gold. And so we also have other sources, such as Julius Africanus and Eusebius of Caesarea. They also, and that one was, Julius is dated to circa 160 AD, Eusebius about 260 AD. They both connect the events of chapter 3 to the destruction of Jerusalem. So there is also historical evidence to support this idea. So, of course, I can't say it definitively, but for me, this would be the most likely date. And if that is the case, it would make it about 16 years after the events of chapter 2. And so you notice that the image he made was 60 cubits high, which is about 27 meters, and 6 cubits wide, which is about 2.7 meters, just under 3 meters. So in essence, it has a height which is 10 times its width. Interestingly, this is a similar ratio and size to the obelisks found in Egypt. And it's certainly not the ratio of a normal human figure, which is more like 1:4. Whatever this was an image of, it would require an enormous amount of gold, even if it was only gold coated. And so again, this seems to be a statement of bravado. You can remember back to chapter 2, he was troubled by the dream. And here it seems the pagan king is trying to reassert his power and authority, showing that he is in control, not the God of Israel. Another possible event which might be connected to this was a coup attempt that occurred about 10 years into Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Now, this was significant enough to have been recorded in the Babylonian Chronicles, and this might make sense of why he undertakes what seems to be a test of loyalty here in chapter 3. Well, whatever his motivation, Nebuchadnezzar, just to show you an obelisk by comparison to the image, kind of fits the ratio. Whatever the motivation of Nebuchadnezzar, he invites all kinds of officials from the civil government, the military, the financial and judicial systems of the empire. So this includes those we might describe as being in executive leadership roles or senior management. So, for example, the satrap governed a large province. The governor was a leader within that province, and he could also be a senior military leader as well. Then there were councillors who were often advisors to the king or other senior leaders. Then there were treasurers. They were senior people in terms of finance. And then there were judges who were senior figures in the legal system. And as well as that, magistrates, and those were slightly lower down in the same system. But then it also ends with the word officials, and that's more like a broad term covering anyone else not mentioned specifically. And that category would have included the 3 Jewish men who are going to become the focus of this chapter. They were administrators within the province of Babylon. The Septuagint adds that they came from as far as India in the west and Ethiopia in the east. And there's no indication in these verses that the people being invited had any idea that this was going to be a test of loyalty through idol worship. So given that the element of worship was hidden, as far as we can tell from those who were invited, this explains why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't disobey the invitation to attend the dedication, because they had at that point no legitimate reason to do so. There was nothing wrong in the king inviting them to a dedication service. Of course, what he's going to do later is wrong, but the initial idea, it seems to be, he's just invited them to dedicate this image. I think a lesson for us is that civil disobedience should not be based merely on personal preference. For example, well, I didn't vote for them, therefore I'm not going to do what they tell me. For us as believers, there has to be a much higher divine standard that has to be reached and breached for a believer to be justified in undertaking any form of civil disobedience. Otherwise, as Paul puts it, the norm for believers should be that we are subject to the governing authorities, Romans 13, verse 1. Now, verse 3 simply repeats the list of people, and it adds that they had all been assembled to the location of the image. Now, something that will become evident if you read through the chapter is that Daniel is missing. So the question arises, well, where is he? What's happened? Okay, but why isn't he mentioned? But we're not told. It's a little bit frustrating, but we're not given any information. However, given the immense courage he shows in this book right throughout, I think it would be fair to assume that he is innocent unless proven guilty. And there might be many legitimate reasons as to why Daniel was absent. And that is mostly likely the reason why he's not mentioned, because he's not there. He's doing something else. But if that doesn't satisfy you, that explanation, well, of course, you could ask him during the 1,000 years of the Messianic kingdom, and I'm sure he'll tell you what was happening at that time. Now, what does make sense is how this fits in the book thematically. So keep in mind that chapter 3 is paired with chapter 6. And here we have a group of 3 Jewish believers during the times of the Gentiles who are all targeted essentially because of the beliefs that they hold and because they are Jewish. And they are persecuted by a Gentile ruler because of that. But in this situation, we see that God intervenes and protects them, ensuring their survival. And then in contrast, later in chapter 6, we're going to see there's only one Jewish man who is also persecuted by a Gentile ruler, but again, due to God's intervention, survives. And so throughout the time period of the tribulation, God will also provide protection for the believing remnant of the nation, especially during the times when they are forced to commit acts of civil disobedience to maintain the essentials of their faith as a witness to Gentile believers. He will do this both collectively for groups of Jewish believers, as we see in this chapter, but also for individual Jewish believers, as we will see in chapter 6. Now, I'm not saying here that God will protect all Jewish believers at all times, but he will ensure the survival of a remnant of believing Jewish people. So that would be apart from, of course, from a very short period of time directly after the rapture. But apart from that, there will always be a believing remnant of Jewish people here on the earth. So what's the situation? Well, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and the herald proclaimed, you are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that the king Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. So you can see there is a long list of musical instruments. And so the intent, the gig's up, as they might say. It's pretty clear now what he's asking them to do. He's gathered them, and essentially he's testing their loyalty. And to make sure that no one misunderstands, they're going to use a universal signal, that of music. And this will consist of various wind and string instruments, including horns made from animal horns, pipes, which are high-pitched wind instruments, lyres, which belong to the harp family, trigons, which were triangular instruments with 4 strings, harps, and Persian bagpipes. And if you're not sure what they look like, you'll see a photo at the bottom there. And basically you see it's made out of an animal bladder or skin, however you want to put it. And basically that's sealed up, and they blow it up with air, and then that makes the sound through the pipe or the reed at the end. So this is then it also adds, just in case, there's every kind of music. So we could have also had potentially percussion instruments, because they're not mentioned, and even singers as well. We're not sure, but certainly there were all kinds of music available. So once they hear the music, they're all to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's image to show their loyalty to him and submission to him. Now, if you're a pagan polytheist, that's not really much of a problem, because you would already believe in many gods, and so for example, showing deference to this one person in this instance wouldn't be much of a big deal. But of course, if you're a monotheist that is believe in only one God, as the 3 Jewish men do, then that is a significant problem. because there's no way they can participate in worshipping this idol without breaking the laws of God found in the Mosaic covenant. So here a line has been crossed. And think of the first of two of the famous 10 commandments in Exodus 20. Forbid serving any other God, and also forbid worshipping any man-made image. But now Nebuchadnezzar is commanding them to break both of these. So it's at this point that as believers, they are now permitted to act in civil disobedience to the king. So verse 7 simply states that as soon as all the musical instruments made their sounds, that everyone, except as we shall soon see these three men, everyone else all bows down to worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar had made. Okay, so let's continue now to see what happens. So we're now going into the next part of the chapter, and it's really focused around the response of these three believers, these Jewish believers. So let's see what happens. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So notice who this is. These are the Chaldeans. These are the local Babylonians. And given their insinuations to the king about him having appointed these Jews, inverted commas, it is clear there is a degree of anti-Semitism behind their actions. Now, keep in mind, we know that Daniel had saved their lives, but as far as they are concerned, they owe these men nothing. And so they are likely jealous and probably thought that locals should have had their positions of authority, not these foreigners. And it's clear, of course, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in fact guilty of entering into an act of public civil disobedience. But as we shall see, they have a just and right reason for this response. But keep in mind their response of disobedience is limited to one specific action. They refuse to fall down and worship the image. You will note there's nothing extra. There's no physical violence on their part or verbal abuse. They don't enter into anything like that. They simply stood quietly while everyone else fell down and worshipped. And I think there's another lesson for us here, that if we are involved in any act of civil disobedience as believers, it needs to be limited to the specific area where the line has been crossed. That any response on our part should not violate other commands or rules of law, especially those God has given us about how we as believers are to conduct ourselves in the New Testament. So basically what I'm saying here, these kind of situations are not an excuse for us to commit evil actions. A reference for that would be Romans 12:17-21. So let's look at the confrontation. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall be immediately cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So, as you might say, to use a phrase, the heat comes on. But notice this is happening in stages. The first stage is pressure to conform to the norms of the majority, not to stand out. Then the second stage is to take his generous last chance offer, to take the easy way out, before they fry and die. And this is often similar to what happens for us as believers in today's society. The early pressure is often to conform to social demands that are given to us in our modern society. But if that doesn't work, then perhaps significant people, such as a boss or other colleagues, might present ultimatums. And if the position is conceded, then the pressure comes off. And everyone is happy again, except God, of course. Now, interestingly, a few years earlier, at the start of the captivity, the prophet Jeremiah had written an open letter to all of those Jewish believers in captivity. In that, he had stated that one of the reasons that they had ended up in captivity was because they continued to worship other gods and idols. So, if these men were to enter into pagan worship of idols, they would be betraying both their God and their nation. And so Nebuchadnezzar's defiant statement, who is the God who can deliver them? Folks, that's about to be answered. All right, so now we get the justification. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O King Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So their statement is clear. They have no need to answer the king in this matter. And that's referring to the fact that their consciences are clear. They know that they have a just and right reason for the civil disobedience they have undertaken. But notice there is no assumption on their part that their obedience will result in divine deliverance. So this is an important fact for us to understand. We never put God in our debt through obedience. Jesus makes this clear when he states, so also when you have done all that you were commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. Luke 17:10. So these three men clearly have the faith to believe that God will save them, but not the arrogance to demand that he does. Their final statement is, no matter what the outcome is, live or die, it will not change the fact that this is a false god and an idol, and they will never serve it or any other idol. They will only serve the one true God. We have an interesting example of a similar kind of incident in the New Testament, given in the book of Acts. In this case, it's the Sanhedrin, who were the leading religious council of the day in Jerusalem. And following the healing of the lame man, they had arrested Peter and John and had gone into an inquiry. And after the inquiry, it states they called them and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But notice Peter's response. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. And this is in light of a specific command that Jesus had given his disciples to go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. So in this situation, they wouldn't be able to obey the Sanhedrin's command without directly disobeying God's. Therefore, at that point, they entered into civil disobedience and continued to share the gospel. But notice, again, the response is not one of vitriol or violence. It is simply stating the fact, with a rhetorical question that has an obvious answer. Of course, they should continue to obey God. So let's return now to chapter 3. And it says that Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Now, this burning fiery furnace in close proximity was quite likely the one that had been used to smelt or melt the gold needed for that statue. Now, it was likely built using earthen mound or bricks. And I've got something, it's not quite the same thing, but it's good trying to give you the idea of what it could look like. Basically, there would have been a large hole at the bottom for putting the fuel in, for fueling the fire, then an access ramp to the top where they could drop the metal in to be smelted, which would include some means of channeling the melted metal into molds or some way of making sheets maybe that could be beaten and formed over the image. So these mighty men that have taken the three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to this fiery furnace seem to have died from flames that flared up during the overheating. They probably came up through the top if it was something like what we see in this image here. But notice a couple of points. Firstly, overheating the furnace would in fact reduce any suffering because they would die quicker. And secondly, Nebuchadnezzar throws them in clothes and all, which spares them the humiliation of being stripped naked. And finally, they are bound, which is completely pointless given what's going to happen. So all this shows that Nebuchadnezzar is in an enraged state. He is not thinking clearly. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. Now, the book of Daniel doesn't clarify whether this term, one like the Son of God's, means that this is an angel, an angelic being, or a theophany. And by that I mean a pre-incarnate appearance of the Son of God as the angel of the Lord. Now, as a pagan, Nebuchadnezzar would have had no awareness at all of the concept of the angel of the Lord, but he certainly would have been familiar with the idea of an angel. And this is reflected in his statement, a son, rather than the son. Whatever the case, God has provided divine deliverance. Notice the only thing affected by the fire was what was used to bind them. They are now unbound and, as it were, chilling out in the furnace. But notice that when the king commands them to come out, they do. So another point for us to note here is that they did not continue in their civil disobedience. Once the issue had been resolved, they returned to being obedient to the commands that were given that didn't cross any lines. So let's look now at the king's declaration. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors sat together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So notice the three men were completely unaffected by the fire, both in terms of their bodies, such as their hair and their clothes. They didn't even smell of smoke. And if any of you have stood by a fire long enough, you know how amazing that is. So all of this is undeniable evidence of divine deliverance. Nebuchadnezzar had his thinking challenged on this matter. His question about which God could deliver them has been answered. He now issues a counter decree to the one he made earlier. Now, no one can say anything against their God. He had started by demanding they honor him. Now the king honors them and actually promotes them. So keep in mind, as we summarize this, that the times of the Gentiles started prior to the church age, and it's going to continue after the bride has been gathered at the rapture. So in terms of the Jewish believers under Gentile authority, there are four lessons we could keep in mind. Firstly, Jewish believers, whether before, during, or after our current church age we're in, they should always resist idolatry. Secondly, Jewish believers are to retain their Jewish identity. They are not to try to become Gentiles. Thirdly, Jewish people throughout the times of the Gentiles will gain prominent positions, but this will likely cause jealousy and anti-Semitism. And this is something that can be seen not only in biblical times, but many times in history, where Jewish people have gained positions of prominence which have caused jealousy. But fourthly, no matter how bad the persecution gets, a believing remnant will always survive. This will be true during the times of the Gentiles in general, but also true more specifically during the Great Tribulation, or the time of Jacob's trouble in particular, something which Daniel is going to emphasize in the second half of his book. So that's a summary of this chapter. So what about an application for believers in this church age? Well, all believers, whether Jew or Gentile in this church age, were also members of the body of Messiah. And so there are several principles that are relevant to us from this chapter. Firstly, the norm for a believer in this age is obedience to governments and authorities. Civil disobedience is the exception, not the rule. Secondly, civil disobedience can and should only occur when a government or authority requires a believer to act in disobedience to the clear commands of God found for us in the New Testament. So Acts 4 is an example there. Thirdly, any response of civil disobedience should be limited to the point at which the line has been crossed. And any actions we take should be consistent with the behavior required by a believer, remembering we are to be Christ-like. They are never an excuse for us to commit acts of evil. Fourthly, if we respond justly to a situation where we are needed to obey God rather than man, we can have faith that God can save us from those situations, but we should also never assume that he has to. And a good example of this is in the book of Acts, where in the same chapter, the Apostle James is executed by Herod, yet in another scenario later on in the same chapter, Peter is saved through divine deliverance. So one believer dies, another believer delivers, all in the same chapter. So keep in mind, obedience to God never puts God in our debt. Therefore, it is a matter of God's will and not ours as to whether divine deliverance occurs or not. So that brings us to the end of this chapter, chapter 3 of Daniel.